I'm going to go ahead and get started. Welcome and good evening to everyone. I am Kathy Mansfield. I'm the Executive Director of the Master of Arts in Financial Integrity program at Case Western Reserve University. And I'd like to welcome you all to our program tonight called The Laundryman. I just want to say that we'll have information up in the chat for the evaluation that you fill out in order to get CLE or ACAM CE credit. And I'll also be posting some information at the end of the seminar that has some more information about that. I have a really easy job tonight. I'm just going to introduce John Moody. John is the AML Manager and Vice President of AML Operations Governance Group at Huntington National Bank. And he is also very, very active in the ACAMS chapter, the Northern Ohio ACAMS chapter, and is one of our professors. And John is going to introduce our speaker. So John, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Kathy. And welcome everyone to this joint Case Western Reserve, MAFI, and Northern Ohio ACAMS chapter event. I want to remind our ACAMS members of an event coming up on May 4th at 3 p.m. Pretty much anyone is welcome, but ACAMS members for the chapter can earn 1 credit for that. And the topic is going to be cryptocurrency, AML, use cases for banks and why banks should care about it. And our speaker is Stephen Ryan. He's the founder and COO of CipherTrace. As Kathy indicated, there'll be a link in the chat for the Northern Ohio chapter members to earn their credit. Please make sure you utilize that to get onto the list to earn that credit. And also for our chapter members, expect a brief survey to be sent out in the next week. We need to get some information from you regarding the fall voting on board members.
And John, before you introduce Ken, I'm sorry, I should have said this.
Okay.
If you have a question during the presentation, please don't use the chat function, use the Q&A function, and John and I will be watching the Q&A box. Thanks, sorry.
Oh, no problem, Kathy. I was just thinking of that when you mentioned it, so reading my mind. So this evening we have a great speaker, Ken Rajek. He's a financial crimes consultant now, over 25 years experience in money laundering and as practicing laundryman. He's a financial compliance consultant. He's a veteran of the conflict in the Vietnam-Cambodia engagements war and holds combat infantryman badge and Bronze Star medal. He's currently living in Miami, and interestingly enough, he was laundering money for the Colombians and domestic cartels, flooding some of the American streets with cocaine. And when he was caught, he was actually in love with a cop at the time. So very interesting background. It should be a very good presentation for those of you that have not heard Kenneth. And those that you have, it's been a good 10 years since you probably heard him. So with that, Ken, I will open up to you to go ahead and give us your presentation.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Kenneth Rajek. I've been living and working in Miami, Florida for the last 50 years on one side of the problem or the other. I'm going to give you a little bit of my story this evening, and then I'd like to talk to you briefly, if we have enough time, about some of the emerging threats and problems that I look at and that I see every day. For those of you who don't read my work, I have a blog called Kenneth Rajek's Financial Crime Blog. It's been around for 10 years. If you're interested, feel free to take a peek. You'll find that I only deal with financial crime, money laundering, terrorist financing, and financial crime. And I don't pull any punches. There are no ads on the thing. And basically, I just call them as I see them. Okay, for those of you who have never seen me speak or haven't read my book, The Laundryman, I come from the same type of all-American background as a lot of you people. Grew up in the state of New York. Got my bachelor's degree in history. And then I left to take a master's in economics. But of course, that was in the middle of the Vietnam War, and a person could only get basically 4 years worth of college deferments. So I was classified one, and I went ahead and enlisted in the military. I got in the Army in 1968. By 1969, I was in Vietnam, and in 1970, I was also in Cambodia. I can tell you that it was a formative experience. You kind of separated those of us who went from those of us who didn't go, but I'm not here to talk about that. I just wanted to give it to you so you'd understand a little bit about my experience level. When I worked in Vietnam, I was in the 1st Infantry Division and the 25th Division. Okay, I come home from the military, and I got to go back and move my education forward. So I got a law degree from the University of Miami because my parents had moved to Miami Beach while I was in the service. I went to work at a very interesting Miami law firm. It was the only Miami law firm that actually had a branch in London and a branch in New York instead of the other way around. I was pushed willingly or unwillingly into the banking law department, which I'm sure some of you people might understand can be a little boring at times. And I spent the next, 5 years, bringing suits on behalf of banks, trust companies, and basically a number of financial institutions or non-bank financial institutions. At that point, like a lot of young lawyers, what I did was I felt my ambition and I left the firm. I opened up my own firm. Whereas before, what I'm doing is I'm representing banks and credit unions. Now it's the flip side. Now I'm suing banks and credit unions because I live in probably one of the most litigious cities in the country. There came a time as the years went by that I was getting a divorce from my first wife. And this is how the whole story begins. You know, when you're getting a divorce, you move out of your house and you need to find a place to stay. Well, this was 1980s Miami, which most of you might remember was the Miami Vice period. And I knew a couple young ladies who worked in a nightclub nearby, and they said, Ken, why don't you just come and move in with us? You know, I was reminded of a couple situation comedies of the period. And it was good for a couple of months, but then one of the young ladies went to Ohio and was in a motorcycle race and fell off and broke her leg. So she called me up and said, Ken, listen, I've broken my leg. I'm going to be out for 2 months. I can't come home. I'm going to go stay with a friend of mine who lives in Miami's Shenandoah district. For those of you who don't know the city, it's just south of the downtown area, and it's a predominantly lower middle class Latin area. Well, like a good roommate, I went over to visit her and to see what was going on. And I met the gentleman who was taking care of her. And it was like I was looking at myself. This gentleman had also served in Vietnam. He'd been in the Marines where he'd been wounded at the Battle of Quai San. And he was my exact age. He happened to have been from St. Louis. But what was his occupation? He was a teacher of Spanish, a consultant working on the clock by the hour. Now, what is an Anglo from St. Louis doing teaching Spanish in a Latin town? Well, the interesting thing about it was his parents were both missionaries. At a very young age, he moved to Oriente province in Cuba, the easternmost province, and he grew up not only as a bilingual individual, but as a bicultural one. So when Castro came to power, the family moved to South Florida. The father became a minister in town. And my new soon-to-be roommate said, hey, listen, I'm going to go to Bible college and I'm going to teach Spanish. The only thing is, he had unique skills. What were his skills? Well, he could move in both the North American Anglo world and he could move in the Latin world. Not only had he lived in Cuba, he'd also lived in Ecuador and a couple other countries as a very young man after Cuba. So therefore, he was perfectly comfortable living in a Latin part of town and being totally part of that environment. Well, when I needed to move out and find another place, because remember here, there's only one more roommate and I'm going to have to go somewhere. My new friend Bob said, why don't you move in with me? I've got a 2-bedroom house. I'm the only one here, and come and live with me until you find a permanent place. Well, of course, I agreed because we had kind of hit it off over the period of time. And he was a bachelor like myself, liked having a good time, always seemed to have plenty of girlfriends and interesting people around. And I said, you know what? Why not? Well, so I moved in with him, and it was great for about 2 weeks. Then one night in the middle of the night, I'm sound asleep and I hear a huge knock on the front door. So I reach up and I peek out, and what do I see? But a whole bunch of people in suits coming to the front door. I thought, what were these, process servers, or what was this? Anyway, it wasn't my business. So I went back to sleep. But then about 10 minutes later, bang, 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 I hear a bang on the knock on the back door. What does that mean? Well, somebody happens to be at the back door and is coming in with a couple satchels. Now, I had no clue what this was, but of course, later I realized and learned what it was. My roommate, so to speak, happened to be a broker, but he wasn't a broker of real estate or any other legitimate transaction. He was a broker of controlled substances. He was the middleman between Colombians who were trafficking narcotics into North America and Americans and Canadians who were basically wholesaling and retailing it. And I am in this house, I'm the roommate. Now, I'm sure you realize I grew up as a child in the 1960s. I was always, frankly, in favor of the decriminalization of lower level drugs. And I didn't have a problem with that. Of course, I was a lawyer. I had basically sworn an oath to defend the Constitution of the state of Florida, but I didn't see that as an inconsistency. Well, I happened to live in that house for 6 months. And during that time, I was exposed to every facets of that type of transaction, of that world, of that culture. And basically what I got was an unasked master's degree in narcotics trafficking. Why? Because I got to meet the wholesalers. I got to see how it operated. I got to see how they got paid, how the transporters worked, who were the people on the fringes, the professionals, the accountants, the attorneys, the suppliers, who are the people, who are the consumers, who are the wholesalers. So at the end of the 6 months, of course, I thought, it was probably too dangerous for me to be there. So I decided, I need to move out, and I need to move forward back with my practice of law and stop spending too much time in this house. And of course I did so. But what I noticed was shortly thereafter, a lot of the people that I had met in this house came to visit with me and see me in my office because they knew I was a civil practitioner. And what they wanted to do was they wanted me to provide legal services. Well, what do you mean by legal services? Remember, these people were all involved in narcotics trafficking, and in a big way. They wanted me to perform what would be normal civil services that you would ask any lawyer to do for you. I'm going to buy a building. I'd like to sell my house. I want to buy a boat. I'm going to sell my airplane. I'm going to build a brand new business. Now, these are all perfectly kosher and legitimate for any civil lawyer to do. But think again about basically what's the underlying purpose? It's to facilitate a narcotics conspiracy. Well, of course, overtly and individually, each and every one of these types of transactions, maybe a nod and a wink to understanding what the purposes were. Somebody came in the answer. Worked for a lot of basically broker dealers, a number of non-bank financial institutions as counsel. So I understood about all types of legitimate transactions. But what they wanted from me was, we'd like you to launder $6 million for us. It's all in cash. We'll leave it in your hands. Tell us what to do. Well, of course, never having done an illegal transaction, I had no clue as to what to do. However, you know the old story that young lawyers are very ambitious. And if they get a new type of business, if they're ambitious and smart and sometimes a little greedy, they'll take it and then they'll learn from somebody else how to do it. And that's exactly what I did. You know how in your family, you might have somebody who's a little bit of I guess you'd call them a black sheep. And you know you can choose your friends, but you can't choose your family. And even though my family consisted of several attorneys, there was one in our family who was a black sheep. One of my cousins had once stolen $6 million from the government of the Republic of Cuba in a very spectacular fraud that people still talk about in Miami as the Cuban coffee caper, which I could probably tell you about in a half hour, but suffice it to say that it cost him 3 years worth of his life in subsequent US custody as a prisoner. Right about the time he's getting out of prison, that's when somebody's coming to me and asking and saying, hey, Ken, I need to launder $6 million. So of course, what do? I better go talk to my cousin, because if anybody knows how to do it, he does. Well, he turned me on to a lawyer down in the Caribbean, explaining to me that I need to get in touch with this person and that he'll facilitate the transactions. Now that knocked me over, because this was one of the most prominent, if the most prominent person in a country in the British West Indies that still belonged to the UK. And this gentleman was basically the constitutional advisor to Her Majesty's government on that island. But he wore other hats as well, because in addition to being the constitutional advisor in that country, in another neighboring country about 25 miles away, he had another law office, and that country had recently become independent. And he happened to be the ambassador to the United Nations from that country. He was also the ambassador to the United States and the ambassador to the OAS and the minister plenipotentiary without portfolio. In other words, this gentleman happened to be the local version of Henry Kissinger in his jurisdiction, somebody who was so prominent that his arrest would have made huge diplomatic waves. So I am flying down to the Caribbean. I'm going to meet with this man who I knew before in legitimate business, Americans investing in the Caribbean. And what I'm doing is I'm forming corporations. These corporations have what we call bearer shares, meaning there's nobody's name on the front page of the stock certificate. It's payable to bearer, just like a dollar bill. You want to transfer all the millions in your bank account and you have a bearer share company, you just slide that corporate document over to somebody on the other side of the table. And not only do they now own the corporation, they now own all its assets. Needless to say, bearer shares are illegal in most of the civilized countries of the world. But at that time, and even now, it was still legal tender. All right, I'm forming some of these corporations, and I fly back to Miami and I meet with the clients and they come in and talk to me. But I take a good look at them and I realize that if we're going to smuggle $6 million out of the United States, we have to look like we're going on some sort of business trip, because otherwise we'll probably get stopped at the airport and we'll all be arrested. And of course, they look like narcotics traffickers. They've got a lot of gold around their neck. They're wearing flashy, exclusive clothing. And it's not the sort of thing that is going to pass muster. So we go out and we dress them all up as bankers and lawyers, as professionals. The men in suits and the ladies happen to be wearing conservative dress. Now, I say females because some people say, well, wait a minute, aren't most drug kingpins men? Well, it's an equal opportunity employer. That means that basically, if you're ruthless enough to get to the top in that business, you can shine just as anybody else will. And as a matter of fact, one of the kingpins in that organization, who was the head of their, I guess you'd call it, human relations department, was a woman and was the only one who managed to escape the later dragnet of arrests. Okay, so we got everybody dressed up as bankers. And next I need to know, how am I going to smuggle $6 million out of the country? Well, it turns out that I go back to my cousin again, and he said, go up to Fort Lauderdale Executive Airport. There's a company called Hop-A-Jet. Go see Harvey Hop. He's a World War II bomber pilot. He's got a Learjet fleet. He'll carry anything anywhere in the world as long as it's not drugs. So I go up there and I meet Mr. Hop, who of course now I'm sure you realize is no longer alive. And for a substantial amount of money, we conclude a deal, and a day or two later, myself and my clients all dressed up to look like we're going to a convention in San Juan, board the plane and fly out of the US with $6 million in cash, no baggage, and evil intent in mind. In the 10 years I was involved in that business, I was never stopped or interdicted once. Why? Because our customs service is focused on inbounds. Outbound transactions, with very rare exceptions, ever get any kind of scrutiny. So private jet travel is, of course, the first thing you want to look for if you're looking at a client who you might say, guess what? That might be a drug trafficker. That might be a money launderer. That might be a financial criminal. They don't want to go through the rudimentary, at that time, but now very, very sophisticated security system. Okay, so we fly out of the United States. And 2.5 hours later, we're over the East Caribbean. And of course, where we're going, they don't sell jet fuel. And as such, we need to refuel for the trip back. So we land in St. Martin, or for some of you who've ever traveled to the Caribbean and gone on vacation, Sint Maarten on the Dutch side and Saint Martin on the French side. It's a real curious island of which half of it belongs to France and half to the Netherlands. Now, the trick for this is, why are we going to come into this country with $6 million and risk it being seized? St. Martin is truly and beneficially a duty-free port. 300 years ago, when France and the Netherlands split the country in two, somebody decided that why should they have to go through customs and immigration just to cross the border in between the two halves of the island? And they eliminated customs for 99% of all transactions. So when we come into St. Martin, they're not looking to go through our bags. They're not looking to search our plane. They're just looking to collect some money for landing fees and also for us to refuel our plane. Now imagine that we aren't coming in with $6 million. What if we're coming in with basically a vial with the bubonic plague? What if we're coming in with the plans to the cruise missile? What if we have a terrorist on board? Again, they're not even looking on the plane. They're just taking our money, and we're departing, and we're going a few miles away to a British-owned island called Anguilla, after the French word for eel, which is the most easternly island in the East Caribbean. The next stop is the Azores. Now, that airport and that runway are all World War II vintage, and it takes somebody who's quite good to land when it comes to short field landing in a jet. But of course, our friend Mr. Hop and his people have been flying into these tax havens, which is what this is, for a number of years, and are able to navigate their way into that rather crude system as easily and adroitly as possible. Of course, when you go to an airfield which is in the third world, the first thing you're going to do as a pilot is you're going to fly over low and slow to make sure, well, are there any animals running across the road? Are there any holes in the runway? Was the runway damaged? Is there a crashed plane on the runway, which you'll run into at the moment you land? So while doing that, in the back of the plane, remember, my clients are dressed up as bankers, but they're not bankers. They are drug traffickers, and they are somewhat rough around the edges, as you can imagine, in that rough and tumble trade. And they're having, would you believe it, a champagne party, because for them, they don't consider this to be risky compared to smuggling drugs into the United States basically right under the nose of US law enforcement. Well, they're disturbing the pilot because they're making a hell of a noise. So what he does is he decides to shut down all that noise by executing what's called a barrel roll. That's where you turn the plane upside down, slow and slow. But as long as you keep the forward momentum, they don't even spill their drinks. But of course, they quiet down. Okay, so we're coming into Walled Lake Airport in Anguilla. We land and we go into the customs shed. And in any other country, we would have been arrested, confined, the money confiscated, and we'd be looking at long terms in a very primitive prison for money laundering, for racketeering, and for any one of a number of other smuggling infractions. But what does the person at customs say when he sees those suitcases full of cash? He says, close it up right now. Do not let anybody in the airport see that. Now, why is that? Well, it's because we were coming into a tax haven which survives based upon what you call flight capital, illicit money, money which has been earned as the proceeds of crime. What all this money was doing was it was creating a financial middle class in the country, whereas somebody whose relatives had been working in a hotel, fishing, going to Puerto Rico to take a menial job, having to go to the United States or the United Kingdom to work and send money home. These people are now all working in a local bank or a local financial service business or a tiny little shop where they'll answer the phone on your behalf and make it look like you have a company there, but you've never been there in your life. We're going to the Valley, which happens to be this tiny little capital of Anguilla. We're all loaded up in a bunch of four-wheel drive Jeeps. And of course, guess what? Guess who picked us up and who met us there was our lawyer. Why? Because he was in charge in that particular jurisdiction and everybody knew it. We go into the Capitol and we go to a shopping center, the likes of which you'll never see in your life unless you're involved in financial crime. The shopping center was totally deserted, but it was all banks, trust companies, and financial service firms. We go into a local bank, part of which was owned in a large percentage by that lawyer. And the president of the bank had been the former senior official at a Chase Manhattan branch and hired away at a huge salary. And the money goes into the counting machines and the counterfeit detectors, and it's all going into certificates of deposit. Well, because a lot of these traffickers, once they start amassing wealth, become businessmen just like legitimate people, and they want a return on their capital. But they also may need some of this money over a period of time to buy and sell narcotics. So they quite smartly stagger the dates in which all of these CDs will mature so they can avoid, you got it, an early withdrawal penalty. Okay, so all of our money is done. All of our cash is turned into money put in a bearer share company, not identifiable and not returning to any of these individuals. And when the business is done, I follow my little list again. And I go over to a restaurant over on the ocean side where when you ask for lobster, they put on the snorkel and the fins and they dive in and they get one from you from the ocean bottom. And they cook it up and you drink French champagne and eat lobster and then get on the plane and fly back home. But that's when the magic starts, because a few hours after you leave, a courier service comes in from New York. This service is designed to take all of that cash out of the bank and put it into the US banking system, because it's no longer the property of these clients or even their corporations. It's now on deposit at the offshore bank. The money's going into an account, and that night, a lot of it is being drawn out by a Fortune 500 company at a very high rate of interest, for which the bank is compensated, and for which, of course, the offshore bank is compensated by the New York bank. Everybody but the tax man is making out like a bandit here. Why? Because the classic method by which cash is laundered is being followed to a T. Placement. The placement was the actual placement of the cash into the bank offshore. Layering. The money is being transferred to an onshore US bank. Later, some of that money was being transferred to the Republic of Panama. From there, it was going to Asia, and it was coming back in to the city, the financial district in the UK in London, for the purchase at that time of a building for which no investigator could ever determine that the original funds were cocaine profits from the streets of New York and Chicago. That was my first entry into the bloody money laundering war. That was the first of 10 years worth of involvement in that kind of business. Every week, I would get on a plane, whether it was a private plane or commercial aviation, fly into a tax haven jurisdiction, transfer funds, move money around to disguise its criminal origins. There we go, layering again. Once a month, I would go on trips to Europe for investment purposes, to meet clients, to advance their business. And as such, it was a very fast-paced life. I didn't take one vacation for several years because I didn't need a vacation. My life was one international destination after another. Also, in that business, you can't afford to stop and take a break because you never can tell when your adversaries, that is US law enforcement, is coming after you. So you need to be tough on yourself, tough on your clients, but your job is basically to protect people who are in a criminal enterprise. Well, I'll cut through the whole 10 years as how it worked. While I was doing so, of course, I was not married, had no children. It was the kind of life where you had to be very careful about what you did and what you didn't do. And your circle of friends was limited to those people engaged in criminal pursuits because you couldn't trust other people and they couldn't trust others either. Well, there came a time when one of my clients, who was from Paris, had a shipment seized in Miami with about 800 kilos of cocaine. And my representation of him, he was a couple years later acquitted after a jury trial. But my representation of him put me square in the crosshairs of our law enforcement community, and I became targeted. 5 years after I was targeted, I was indicted. But during that period, I had a chance to basically live the kind of life that people might dream about, but which always has unfortunate and untoward consequences. As it was mentioned in the beginning, and you can read about it in my book if you would choose to read it. I had a girlfriend at the time who lived with me, who was at first a police detective and then became a police psychologist under, I guess, what you would call don't ask, don't tell to the nth degree. We all grew up in the 60s and we all thought that drugs should be decriminalized. And that's an issue of taking it to a position that most people then or even now wouldn't choose to do. And for that, one day I was sitting in my office and a couple people from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division came in, and certainly with a subpoena, which I, of course, chose not to respond to. And probably about 2 years after that, I was indicted and charged with racketeering, which is basically the business of being a career criminal, committing multiple criminal acts over a long period. And as such, I was guilty of that. I was also guilty of interfering with the lawful collection of revenues for the IRS because my job was to keep the client's dirty money out of the hands of the taxman. And of course, since I was guilty and I wasn't going to be thinking about spending the next 25 or 30 years of my life in prison, I pled guilty and drew a sentence of 4 years in federal prison. Trooped off to prison, 20 years out of the military. Going to a prison wasn't too much different. As a matter of fact, it was inside an Air Force base, but it was minimum security. About 6 months after I got to prison, a very wise gentleman from the Marshal Service came to me and said, "Listen, Ken, you started out in life as a soldier and as a legitimate good lawyer and looked at how you have strayed. You need to switch back to the right side of life, and you need to switch sides now." I then participated in the first American-Swiss money laundering case, as some of my clients, against my wishes, had moved some of their money to Switzerland. As a result, my sentence was reduced to 2 years, and I am removed from prison after 19 months, a little less time than I spent in the military, and kicked out the door, and I am back in Miami without my law license. I've been married since then, and without a wife and without a means of support or any kind of income, because in that life, you want to spend your money as fast as you can because you doubt that you'll live to see the end of it. Well, then again, somebody who was an intelligence sergeant from the west coast of Florida called me up and said, "Listen, Florida law enforcement was trying to catch you for 10 years. You've got a lot of tradecraft, techniques you know what the basic methods of money laundering are, and you know about the more esoteric methods. How about you teach some of our investigators how to catch people like you? Well, I got on a plane, I flew to Daytona Beach, and I stood in front of 500 angry-looking law enforcement detectives. And in the course of a day, I explained to them how to catch people like me. That's how I spent the 1990s, was getting on a plane and working on the law enforcement side of trying to make amends for what I did. And then again, 9/11 happened. And then after that, the bankers and the lawyers in town who really wouldn't talk to me, all of a sudden are realizing that I have certain specialized skills and that I would be of use to them. And then one day, one of these lawyers called me up and said, Ken, listen, I have to give a lecture on money laundering at a conference on Miami Beach, dealing with a specific subject. And I've been called to Argentina on urgent business. Can you then please give me your time and do the lecture for me? Of course, I'm always happy to help. I went over and gave the lecture. And after the lecture, two executives from a very large company came to me and said that they had a problem. They were taking all sorts of investment capital from European nationals, and they had one that was ready to invest $25 million. And he had been vetted and basically due diligence had been done. But the owner of their company wanted a second opinion. So I then performed enhanced due diligence on this gentleman. And I found out that he happened to be originally in life a thug who committed extortion on behalf of certain customers. And he later ended up owning several television stations and was a very wealthy man. But his roots were, of course, criminal. I explained that I had found a photo of him getting off a plane in Eastern Europe, and meeting him at the bottom of the stairs was one of Russia's oligarchs. So based on that, I got hired from this company, which at that time was the largest of its kind in the world, selling certain secondary types of investments in life insurance. And I only did due diligence for the world's worst customers, with the most high-risk clients. You're from Colombia, from Russia, from Turkey, from who knows wherever you really were from. My job was to determine whether or not something would happen that would rule you out as a high risk, or whether or not they could accept your millions. So here I go from being a banking lawyer to a career money launderer to a compliance officer, all in the same lifetime. And I can tell you that I had more fun catching people laundering money than I ever had being a money launderer. Why? Because I knew all the tradecraft. I knew all the techniques. I knew all the strategies. We have a little bit of time. I can tell you just a couple of the examples. And this is the sort of thing that you see every day, but it goes right by you. One client came in, and he was supposedly a dot-com millionaire from out west, and he owned huge pieces of property all over the American West. But I met him, and I just didn't think that he was, frankly, Bill Gates material. So I did some real digging. And even though he came up squeaky clean, I was still not satisfied. I have a rule, and the rule is that if you are possibly a target of money laundering, if you're involved in money laundering or financial crime, and I can't find anything wrong with your background, I'm going to broaden my search. You may be clean, but what about your advisors? What about your lawyer, your accountant, your stockbroker? Who might be the person that's actually doing all this for you? Who's facilitating your financial crime? Well, I found his accountant was clean, but this guy the client lived in Salt Lake City, and his lawyer happened to live in Las Vegas. Now that's a red flag, because this is a multimillionaire. If you know anything about high net worth clients, you know that they're very demanding. They will call you up at 10 o'clock at night and tell you to come to their office when you have a problem. They'll make you come back from a European vacation because they need you right then and there. And if you don't come back, you lose the client. So I knew that having a lawyer in another jurisdiction was a red flag. So I go to town on the lawyer, and I see that many years ago, he'd written an article in a law review publication about offshore tax havens. That's the first strike. Then I find out that several years ago, he had been charged with money laundering in Memphis, and the case had been made to go away. It had never gone to trial. That's when I realized I was dealing with somebody who was very good and we couldn't take his money. I'll give you another one. The client is a financial service professional from Montevideo, Uruguay. He's selling some businesses and he is going to be investing his own money, $10 million. Okay, if somebody is that affluent, they have a huge footprint online. If you're making that kind of money and you have that kind of wealth, what are you doing with it? Well, you probably sponsor a soccer team. You probably give a lot of money to charity. You may have several other satellite businesses totally unrelated to what you do. But this guy was a ghost, total ghost on the internet. His footprint was his sole investment company, and that's it. Okay, when you find somebody who is a ghost and you can't find anything, if he's ever shown up anywhere outside of the norm, that means you go to the 25 biggest newspapers in the world and you look for this gentleman to see whether or not he's ever shown up there with any negative information. You don't rely on search engines, you physically do it yourself, because half the time the search engine one of Mexico's biggest narcotics traffickers, who was a fugitive, had been we just lost the internet connection. Oh, I don't know what happened. Oh,
I think you're back now, Ken.
oh, am I back?
Yep.
Okay, I'm back. All right, so I'm sorry. All right, so here's a guy who's a narcotics trafficker. He happens to be arrested in Sydney. He's wanted in Mexico. He's going to go to prison for the rest of his life. He wants to bond out before the extradition hearing, and that's a rare thing. He offers a $25 million property located in Sydney, basically an estate, to guarantee that he'll appear. And he says that his financial advisor owns the property, and he will then call in from London to confirm that this is the case. Well, that's my guy from Uruguay. I have no idea that he even had a business in the United Kingdom. And he's calling up and saying that he will stand fast for this gentleman. So I declined the investment. When you do that, you need to be very careful, because some of these people don't play around. And one day, if you do something that they don't like, you may make a stop to get a drink on the way home and never get there. So most of the time, compliance officers come up with some sort of legal gobbledygook saying that their investigation turned out that you were not acceptable under the regulations of the firm or of the bank, and as such, you were declined. You never say, well, we stopped you because you're a criminal. But in this case, I was confident enough about it just to say that the gentleman had issues and therefore we can't take his money. Well, he actually called up the compliance department complaining, and he demanded to speak to the person who had ruled on this. And I'm not shy, as you can imagine, and I took the call. And he said, why didn't you take accept my money? And I said, listen, if you're a close associate of a known criminal, we can't take your money at all. That's our policy. Well, he didn't argue with me about it, because he now knew that I was aware of his situation. But he asked me the one thing that somebody will once tell you if you catch them. He said, and I quote, can I get my money back? To which I said, it's already been refunded to you. But what I didn't tell him was that I had alerted law enforcement about who he was and what he tried to do. That's kind of like what I did every day as a compliance officer. And I can tell you that it was very fulfilling. I mean, I was at work every day at 7 a.m. in Fort Lauderdale because I knew it was already 12 o'clock in London and I needed to be on top of it day and night. I'd probably still be there today. But what happened is that one day I'm working at my desk and I hear a little voice behind me. A man says, sir, step away from your computer. Let me see your hands. I turned around and there's somebody in a full uniform with gun and badge of the US Customs Service. Now, what's this? I already paid my debt to society. But then as I look down the hall, I see that everybody else has got a law enforcement official behind them. And we're all herded into this conference room. And a man gets up, and before he even opened his mouth, I knew who he was. He had been, until very recently, the United States Attorney for the Southern District of Florida in Miami. He was then in private practice, and he says, I have just been appointed the administrator of this business, and you're all fired. It turned out that a couple of years later, the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that one of the investments that the company was making should have been registered with the Securities and Exchange Commission, and they dismantled the whole company, a billion-dollar business. Then they found out that a portion of the business was actually a very cleverly disguised Ponzi scheme that the people who worked there didn't have any clue that how it was being operated. Well, and if that's not enough, I'm back out on the street and I'm contacted by the then owner of WorldCheck, who then decides that the WorldCheck website, which is a location for the portal into the database, needs to be awakened so that it can become of service to the public. And I'm hired on a 5-year contract for WorldCheck to be their financial crime consultant, to write about financial crime every day and to travel around the world and talk to all of their clients, whether they're government or private industry, about how money laundering works and how you can stop it in-house. Over the course of that 5 years, I worked in more than 100 countries, many of them more than once. There isn't any other place I haven't been except for Antarctica on behalf of my then boss. And I can tell you that I met bankers all over the world, found out they all had basically the same problems and the same difficulties in resolving them. Then there came a time that WorldCheck was bought out by Thomson Reuters and ceased to exist as a permanent entity. And I took that then period to write my autobiography and to reopen my blog, which was 10 years ago. And since then, I've been consulting with banks, our intelligence services, banks in Canada, intelligence and law enforcement in Canada, and anybody who has problems that requires enhanced due diligence, which requires somebody who's been on the other side of the street and can understand all the perspectives, the law enforcement perspective, the banking perspective, the money launderer's perspective, and of course, the banker's perspective. Well, I think now that we're getting close to the point where we can take some questions, and I'm going to turn it over to the moderator.
Sure. So we have one question. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Sorry, I got your internet is unstable warning. One of the attendees asked, what made you turn to crime and how do you become bankable after? Are you even bankable?
Okay, am I back on? Yes, I am. All right,
Yeah,
well, yes, ma'am. At that point in my life, I didn't consider what I was doing a crime because at that point in my development, remember, I'm in my 30s at that time, I'm 75 now. And at that point, I really thought that our government was going to be required to decriminalize marijuana. It's just now happening now, 50 years later. But I didn't consider it to be a crime. I considered it to be a victimless crime. I didn't pick up on it until a few years later that there were so many dark sides to it. Am I bankable? I'm available as an expert witness. I'm not a bank lawyer. I surrendered my license many years ago. I'm not in that world. The world I'm in is problem solving. And my situation is that when things go wrong, that's when people call me up. I'm not there to do routine compliance. I'm there to ensure that bad guys don't win.
Great. We have another question. What would be the best advice that you would give to an AML compliance professional?
Good question. Very good question. All right. The problem is that most people in AML are not as qualified as they possibly should be. To be involved in anti-money laundering and combating the financing of terrorism, you need to really be a Renaissance person. First of all, you need to have basically, you need a liberal arts degree. You can't go into this from being an accountant. You need to be well-versed in geography and history, because you're going to find that people are going to do things to you that later on, you'll wish you understood that this individual who comes into your office and gives you a very credible story about his background and his company is in a company which doesn't have any overseas transactions. You're going to require a level of not just intelligence and learning, but you're going to have to understand how these businesses operate. Because frankly, the way that they win over on compliance officers is because they give you a credible situation and you don't have enough time in your busy day to enhance due diligence the problem and get your answer. My advice, quite frankly, is the best way to be a good compliance officer. If you want to be a compliance director, you need a law degree. You need to have that background, because in going to law school, and I'm not tooting the horn because I'm a lawyer, you learn about all the different fields in the law, all of which will help you and frankly are going to be the one thing that's going to propel you to the top. Take a look at the biggest banks in the United States. Take another look and see who's there, who is the person on top, and what's their educational level. Alternatively, who are the other best people to use in compliance? You'll find that a lot of people who are in senior positions now come out of the military, and they weren't military police. They come from the intelligence community because they learn how to do the type of research, the type of investigation that you need to do in working AML. I understand you have a pile of files on your desk. They've all got to get put out by 5 o'clock because people upstairs are telling you that. But you need to work smarter, not necessarily harder. Intelligence background is another big plus. If your compliance department happens to have somebody who is former retired police detective, that person could be your financial intelligence expert. You can't do it all yourself. You don't have all of this experience. You haven't been a bank lawyer. You haven't been a person involved in crime. You haven't been a regulator. You don't have all these perspectives. You don't understand very much about how the U.S. Attorney's Office works and who they'll indict and who they won't indict. You may not have a real good grasp of federal law and money laundering other than what you get at these lectures. So you need to learn that it's all about education, education, and education. The more classes that you take, especially ACAMs and any other conferences or conventions that you go to, the smarter you'll be. Because not only are you learning, you're networking. So that if you have a problem, you can call up some FBI agent that you met at an ACAMS conference and say, listen, I have this problem. I can't give you the name. Here's the situation. On this set of facts, can you help me? It's all about education.
I just feel like I have to follow that up by saying, of course, we talk about all that in the MAFI program, right? 30 credit hours of banking law, investigations law, et cetera, et cetera. So thanks for the commercial there. We have a clarification. When the person asked you if you were bankable, they meant, are you able to open a bank account given your history?
Good, that's a good question. It depends upon the bank. Some banks, the biggest banks in this country are either of two minds. Some of them will take you, and then after a period of years, all of a sudden somebody runs your name and finds out that you had a money laundering conviction 40 years ago, and they still will throw you out the door. A lot of the others, frankly, don't care, or either don't care or don't check. If a bank ever gives me a question, I mean, you should understand that I'm not under any parole or probation. As a matter of fact, the governor of the state of Florida restored all my civil rights back in the 90s. And, I vote, I've served on a jury. I do everything that you do. The only thing a person like myself cannot do is to possess or keep a firearm. because that requires you go to alcohol, tobacco, and firearms to get a license, which of course they're generally not so inclined to do. But I haven't handled a firearm since since I was in this business, and so therefore I don't find that to be a problem. But I am, I guess you might say I am or am not bankable, depending upon who it is.
We have tons of questions. So the next one
Go
from
ahead.
Dennis Schwartz, who's one of our teachers, is have any changes in the AML programs made an impact on how you would launder money today? Where are the biggest weaknesses now that AML professionals should be what are the biggest weaknesses now that AML professionals should be most aware of?
Well, I think the biggest weakness is workload, because before we even get to these issues and questions, you just not physically don't have the number of hours in the day to do your work in an efficient manner. And you may or may not be able to get enough assistance brought in because of the cost involved to solve those problems. But if anything, money laundering is easier to do now than it was in 1980 or 1990. Why? If I wanted to form a corporation in Anguilla in 1980, I would have to get on a plane and fly there. Now they have something called Acorn. I can just do it from the privacy of my office. Nobody will even know who I am. And I'll have those corporate papers forthwith. And as such, I don't have to worry about this. The technology of the internet has got such a ability for abuse that information goes both ways. When I give a class on tradecraft, on money laundering tradecraft, I always explain to the students that one of the things I used to do on my trips to London is I would go into a pub in the financial district called the City, and I would look around the room very carefully at happy hour. I'd be looking for somebody sitting behind a bar table with a huge number of overseas newspapers and probably a lemonade. And what he was doing was he was looking for targets of opportunity. He's looking for some obscure country in the Pacific that has just opened up a tax haven law because he's going to move money through there in the next 30 days and then get out before law enforcement realizes what it is. He's looking for targets of opportunity. He's finding somebody in Germany who used some unique new item to launder money and who was arrested. He's going to use that technique and lose it. Nowadays, all you have to do is use Google, and you can find just about anything of interest. Of any of the permutations and combinations in the financial crime world are there for the asking, all open source. And as such, back then you were limited only by your imagination. Now you're only limited by the internet. It's frightening.
So I'm actually going to read off the code for the activity since it's just about 8 o'clock.